everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, I'm delighted to have on astrologer, author, lecturer, and translator, Andrea Garrett. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Callum. Thanks for having me.
So today, we're specifically talking about the malefics, the Mars and Saturn issues. Later in the show, I'm actually going to share my charts because I'm now in the midst of a second waxing Saturn square. So I'm going to share my charts and the issues I'm having with Saturn right now. And we're also going to talk about Andrea's class coming up for Kepler in January, which is titled Astrological Remediation. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, we'll be learning everything about how to remedy things in the chart.
Fantastic. So, Andrea, dealing with Mars and Saturn issues. Let's begin.
So, all right, the reason I picked Mars and Saturn issues is we have just a short time today, and in all of remedy theory, the two planets I probably deal with the most are Mars and Saturn. People are always telling me about Mercury retrograde, and I'm like, why is everyone so concerned about Mercury when Mars causes more problems than any planet I've ever seen? As far as when we look at humans behaving badly or behaving in ways that that they don't like. What do couples really complain about? Fights, violence, domestic violence, things like that. So I think Mars is one of the bigger culprits in life, honestly. And then Saturn also causes a lot of issues. So I thought today we could really hone in on these two malefic planets and look at what can we do about cases such as these. So the first slide I have is just, let's start with Mars. The question is, what does Mars energy feel like? And this is all taken right from the book Astrological Remediation, a guide for the modern practitioner, which is a textbook. So it's not a cookbook, like it's not like everything's not listed out by sign, but it does teach you how to remedy pretty much anything in the chart. There's a Mars chapter. So anyway, in there we talk about what do Mars vibrations even feel like. It's like heating, aggravating, poking, contentious, energizing. If you have a Mars problem, you might have an inflammation. Like, let's say you have inflammation in the elbow or something like that. And you're just like, it's like it literally aggravates you from the inside, right? Or you have a headache, these are just very physical symptoms. But that's really the energy of Mars, is it kind of energizes you, but also makes you feel that kind of feeling inside. And so it pushes us onward to do things. Can you imagine humans without Mars energy? That would be kind of milk toast, like they don't do anything. I mean, I guess there are charts that have weak Mars, which is something we could remedy, right? Impassioning, active, and prodding. So if we look at some of the slides up here, heating energy, like a fire is hot, so that would be Martian. A lot of times we look at Mars as inflammation. Inflammation is a fire from within. Really strong martial charts have the potential for things like spinal meningitis, which now I'm not diagnosing anyone here. I'm not a doctor. But like people always say, is it good to have a malefic strong or is it good to have it weak? Well, what the ancients knew is that a planet that is strong can produce what it promises. So it is a malefic planet, and a strong Mars can produce a lot of heat, for example. So it's like Mars and Aries people are some of the most feverish people on the planet. They get red in the face. Mars in Aries lives up in the head right here. And so when they get transits to it, they get flush, or there's a lot of blushing, or, have you ever heard someone say, like, I saw red and then I punched the guy? That would be like Mars and Aries, like their eyeball actually gets more red in there and then they get mad. So if we look at the actual fire slide, the part of the slide here, that is martial energy in a human. It looks red. Mars and Scorpio is another really strong one where we get a lot of red as well. And now that's red in the Scorpio regions where we get things like endometriosis, which is way too much red in the uterus. That would be like where red grows everywhere and it starts in the aura and comes inward. We believe that, like humans grow on a helix of light. And so it comes in the aura and then it steps down into the physical form. And but it's like too much red on the bottom level can cause its own set of issues. But it also causes a really fierce temperament, right? Like if you have Mars in Aries or Mars in Scorpio, the person has enough inflammation to like like really go after what they want, or they're kind of spicy. Like we have these spicy peppers here. So, I think, do you have any comments about Mars energy?
Yeah, I was going to ask you the difference. So you're talking about health as well. In your experience, do you find talking about the speed of the planets, both Mars and Saturn, do you find Mars issues in terms of health is more acute versus Saturn, which is maybe more chronic? Have you found that in your experience?
Absolutely. If you even look at how the transit cycle comes in, Mars will excite a natal planet for about 2 weeks. And so we get an acute health problem that lasts, a flu or a cold lasts, a virus lasts about 2 weeks. And that is a Mars transit, essentially. In babies, fevers come through and you can watch them break exactly on time. And that would be the moon going over Mars. And then it stays and then it breaks all of a sudden. And so, you're absolutely right that Mars is more acute. Saturn's a long, chronic, if we have a Saturn transit, it might last a year. And so we get chronic pain in that part of the body, or tightness or stiffness or something like that. So absolutely. Okay, yeah. And like, how long does a fight with your partner usually last? I mean, usually it's just one day, but then sometimes contention can go on for a few weeks. But when we have a Mars transit, we have the moon come in and trigger it for that day where the fight really ensues. And so it's like really 16 hours is how much, acute energy we get for a fight, because the Mars sits there and then the moon triggers it for, that comes in orb at 8 degrees. And so for 16 hours, we get that moon. So yeah, I mean, this is the cycle. Like, how long does you were talking about road rage? Like, how long does road rage usually last? You know, 5 minutes.
Seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting, because you were talking about relationships before the recording. Now, are you mainly looking at the natal charts of the individuals, or are you using synastry? Maybe if you look at the synastry, maybe there's a Mars square between partners. If it's more of an issue that flares up all of the time, what are your experiences in those dynamics?
Good question. I do look at composite and synastry, but there's different questions we're asking there. Like in the composite, we're saying like, do you constantly forever aggravate each other? Just do you have an aggravated story, basically? Some people rub each other the wrong way kind of all the time, and that would be if we had like a Moon Mars Pluto conjunction, the composite or something like that. And those people might be great ultimate fighting partners, like with they that chart just is martial. But in synastry, absolutely. So I recently had a couple, and I'm not breaking confidentiality, I'm not saying who they are, but they came into my office because they couldn't stop fighting and they love each other very much. And I looked at it and they both had Mars at the 13th degree. And I was like, oh, you guys are Marsing at the same time. And so you basically, it's both of your fault. I mean, like if we were looking at who, I mean, it's not, it's no one's fault, but you know what I'm saying? It's like you're both in the same mood at the same time. And so we can't say it's one of you or the other. It's literally both of you. And, but then sometimes we have a chart, or a situation where there's kind of a violence pattern in a couple, and one of them has a kind of violent chart and the other one doesn't, and that might be like one of them has like a moon Mars Pluto square and the other one doesn't. Well, we know who the culprit is there on the aggravated side of things, so but like I recently had another couple that have their Marses opposed and they can't stop fighting, and it's just like, oh, that's tough. You're both aggravated at the same time, and so it's hard to, but I mean, we can train couples. Absolutely, this is a remedy talk, right? We're not talking about problems without remedies. It's like you can absolutely train a couple to have conflict and get through it and love each other very much. I mean, the first thing we have to stop doing is blaming anyone and saying like it's not your fault or their fault. It's actually celestial, and there's an undercurrent you're facing together. Christian couples do this a lot. They talk about Satan or the enemy. I'm serious. Like, and they'll talk about the heavens, like the enemy from the heavens. I'm like, oh my God. Like, we know about that because like people think I like the planets. So I'm like, not totally. I don't totally like the planets. Like I'm like kind of fighting the planets sometimes, and like saying like Mars is an enemy to peace here in some ways. And so I feel like those couples get it though, that there's an outside force coming into their partnership that's causing an issue. Because if they were they're trying to get along. So why does this contention come in? And um, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of annoying when people can't stop transiting, and I don't want to talk too much, so you're gonna have to interrupt me if or just talk if I'm over talking. How's that?
I love all what you're saying with your experiences, and you've been doing this for what you say over 25 years. I find in terms of aspects, I feel like the opposition, say you've got two people, Mars opposing one another. For me, it's more like of a tug of a war between who's, taking the reins versus a square, which I find is more of an irritation or flare-ups. So it's quite interesting looking at the aspect patterns between charts as well.
Interesting. I love that point because actually, if you look at the Mars opposed, they're in two opposite body systems. Like, if you had Mars in Cancer, like one of the people gets all wound up in the waters of the chest, like and then the Mars and Capricorn person gets all mad and puts their foot down because it's like the bones of the leg. So it's like they have opposite responses to that anger, but they're always getting angry at the same time because an opposition actually functions like a conjunction. Like if the moon hits one, it hits the other. But a square it surges once a week essentially, and it's just different, but they're similar in that they're kind of surging cyclical anger. So I think the next question here is like, why do we have Mars? Like, what does Mars actually need, or why do humans need Mars? And I think we have the need to be passionate, the need to instigate things. One of my favorite things to do on Mars transits is instigate new projects. If you feel that energy of like, I'm bored or I need to do something, it's like text a friend and be like, do you want to start a book club on XYZ? Or like basically be an initiator is a very good Mars activity. Rough housing, kids need Mars. If you see them, sometimes they get that energy where they just need to wrestle or whatever, and that, that's martial. To sweat, rage, contend, playing games at a kind of competitive level is very martial. Move fast, express the internal animal instinct. So if we look at some of these slides on the left, we see these wrestlers. So see how they have red hair? I put them in there because like we even know red as a kind of fiery, like aggravating, like warriors color, because these wrestlers are wearing red to show that they're kind of tough, or um and then you see the wrestlers on the bottom, like those guys are expressing their Mars together. I mean, I think that would be the healthy expression of Mars is two people wrestling, right? Like a lot of times in relationships, when one person has a really strong Mars and the other doesn't, then we get those domestic violence situations where one person's basically wrestling and the other person's being victimized because they can't keep up with that. It'd be like if a heavyweight wrestler went in with a lightweight wrestler, like that's actually dangerous, so I think we're looking for kind of equal Marses,
And it is
or
quite interesting talking from shadow side to things that are productive, because as you said, Mars is taking action, it's taking the initiative. So maybe you have a couple with who works well together, and maybe they're both rock climbers, so they're expressing their Mars by climbing, working together, and using Mars that way. Versus, as you said, maybe if one has a stronger Mars, and then there's some power dynamic there that might be, or issues of victimization, as you've been talking about.
yeah, I love that point actually, that sometimes people express their Mars outside the relationship, but they go in and do sports activities or get it out in other ways, and so it doesn't actually. But you'll see this a lot with like boxers and things like that, like they accidentally have domestic violence situations, and it's like there's usually they're getting it out boxing, but then sometimes the transit comes out at home, and then it's like oops, so yeah, but if you see this guy on the musician on the middle bottom left, it's like a lot of musicians express Mars, through metal music or screams or growlers. I don't know if you know growlers in metal, like whoa, 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 like that's very martial energy. Yeah, people in mosh pits are very expressing their Mars, and then this weightlifter. So I don't know, Callum, what do you think life would look like without Mars?
That's a great question. A lot of couch sitting, not much action. But like I think we said to me before the recording, I think we're both metalheads, so I do miss my mosh pit days, and that's just a great healthy way of releasing pent up energy. And so, yeah, that's an interesting question. What would life look like without Mars?
Well, and can I speak to your chart?
Hmm.
Okay, so you're saying you have Mars and Aries, and that's a really good example. That's a strong Mars, and like a mosh pit is a great place for Mars and Aries to get out their energy. And there's probably several other Mars and Aries people in that mosh pit, so it is a fair, because you're consenting to go into this martial place. And so I think mosh pits are a great place for strong Marses. I had someone recently telling me that they were working in a prison and most of the guys had Mars and Aries in there. And so when the transits would go through Aries, they would all start kind of fighting with each other. And so I thought that was interesting. So, what are problematic presentations of Mars? And maybe you're thinking, well, isn't every presentation of Mars problematic? Absolutely not. I mean, we saw the wrestlers and sporting events, and there's a lot of great expressions of Mars. But problems we see are anger, rage, fevers are a big one. Like fevers in babies. Now, people as they get older get less fevers. When babies are small, the spine is really short, so the planets come in, they bounce down the spine, and so they're trying to grow out and grow new tissue. So I think a lot of Mars burns out tissue, or they get an ear infection, and they have to grow, something like that. But a lot of that is feverishness. So that can happen in adult humans too. Not wanting to sit still. Like if someone's in class and they have a hypermartial chart, these are the people who are like, I didn't do well in school, right? Like these people can't sit still long enough to listen, or wanting to pop out of one's body. We see the Incredible Hulk down there. That's the feeling of when you get road rage. I mean, do you feel like you want to pop out of your body, or what?
Yeah. But like you said, it's very acute. It's within seconds, and it's something as I've matured, I've had to learn to deal with. And now I'm not as bad as I was, say, in my 20s. So it's something, again, going back to the key point here, remediation to learn to mature and to work with that Mars in a healthier way rather than letting it take over.
And one of the things we don't do is repression of Mars. Like a lot of people say, like, calm down, or when the person's having road rage, they just tell me, like, what is wrong with you? You need to, calm down. And that actually doesn't work because they're wanting to pop out of the body. And so, maybe turning on metal and screaming in the car would be a remedy, right? But you're still expressing that urge to pop out of your body. So it's interesting how we work as opposed to like a counselor who's telling you to calm down. Like, well, and maybe they don't all do that, but the urge to explode, wanting to hurt self or others, or sexual frustration. So, this happens a lot with little kids. It's like when they hit kids in school or they bite, they're in a Mars transit and they want to hurt themselves or others. Classically, when people go into mental health situations, they get asked those questions like, do you have suicidal thoughts? Do you want to hurt yourself or others? And these are really assessing Mars issues. Like I think it was Robin Williams, because like, not to be morbid, but he killed himself, right? And I think he has a Mars Uranus conjunction, and that's like one of those like explosive kind of like, I want to hurt myself all of a sudden kind of aspects of personality. And so that's an example of just like unexpectedly just like, I gotta hurt myself, or like, not to be controversial, but cutters, when I see a cutter, I don't get alarmed at all. I'm like, oh, like unexpressed Mars energy. It's like, if you look at Mars in ancient texts, I would say it's cutting instruments or iron. And what it is like when you get all that red coming to the surface, you actually that you want to bloodlet it, is what they would say. But like, so it's like, I think those kind of behaviors are pent up martial energy. And so, should we be alarmed? Well, it's not the healthiest expression of it. And though it shows like a strong spirit, you know what I'm saying? Like like we don't want to say that Mars, like, is Mars good or bad? It just is, right? It just is. But wanting to pop out of one's body is a lot of the expression that people say before they do things like that, is like, I just couldn't get the emotion out. And so but it's like, we know it's building up from the inside celestially. So it's kind of interesting. Is that too controversial for Kepler?
No, like I said, I love your honesty, and it goes back to the webinar you did. And I think people nowadays certainly appreciate honesty, but it's a really great point. And in my own life, of course, I've got a very strong Mars in Aries, angular in terms, etc. Now, my son has a debilitated Mars in Taurus. He actually has a Mars Saturn opposition. That Saturn is in Scorpio, so it's receiving that quite well. However, so what I've done recently is got us both a punching bag. He's 11 now. So we both go out into the garage. If there's tension in the house, I'm like, right, time to go in the garage. And then we start boxing. And then that's a healthy way to express both of our Marses, and it helps release the energy. And it's a skill for him to learn as well and to develop in that fixed earth kind of way, kind of Mars.
Beautiful. I would say Mars and Taurus boxing, 'cause, like especially because Taurus gets the shoulder, like it would be like,
Yeah.
like a little of that too. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I guess if we look at some of these pictures here, just like see that woman like and like the women like just like we all can relate to that feeling, like we've all felt something like that before, So okay. No, this slide is like my students just love passionate Mars syndrome. But PMS, like why do we know about PMS, but we don't know about passionate Mars syndrome, which of course I invented. But this is like PMS, like when people say like I had PMS and then I was mean to you, I'm sorry. It's just like why don't we that's why I'm not worried about Mercury retrograde because I'm so worried about passionate Mars syndrome. I'm constantly dealing with PMS. Like, but if you look at people's PMS cycle does it follow their periods? Not really. Actually, it follows their transits. Like I've been watching this for years. So women are usually the culprits of PMS, right? Although people say men get PMS too. Is what'll happen is you'll have several periods that are fine, and then you have a period that's really bad, right? Well, that's when you're in a Mars transit. Like it's like the transit is what's causing this anger. But then, of course, our culture blames PMS, right? It must be the period. Although I will tell you that in periods, women dump iron, right? Like a lot of iron, Mars problems are caused by iron buildup. People who are born with Mars rising have more red in the hair. They say it's because there's a more iron in red hair. Like literally, and iron is the metal of Mars. Like if you're making it Mars talisman, you want to make it out of iron, right? So there is something about PMS and iron buildup. And then when women flush out all that iron, then they get more palatable, So it could be that on certain, Mars transits right before a period, there's a big buildup of iron and then they dump it or something like that. But I do think this is a joke, kind of, but actually go ahead and make it a meme. Like memes are contagious thought forms. And it's like get this contagious thought form in your mind because you will start realizing, yeah, Mercury retrograde why are we constantly culturally talking about that? That's fine, but can we like now talk about passionate Mars syndrome? Because astrologers could be helping thousands, millions of people with anger issues constantly, you know.
I think this is brilliant. Passionate Mars syndrome. And off topic, I used to love that show. Is that Xena Warrior back in the
Yeah.
day, like the 90s? I love it.
Yeah, right. Warriors are very martial people. It's there are a lot of warrior studies actually. A lot of I would say even I look at Christians sometimes because they're always trying to live well, you know what I mean? And like it's like oh, they go like in warrior typologies and look in that. Okay, so let's look at remedies. I'll speed it up a little bit because we're at 8:30. But so physical remedies for Mars are acupuncture is a big one. If you stick a needle in, it comes as it's like an antenna to get some of that energy out of there. Rolfing, which would be deep tissue massage, icing. No, ice combats heat, right? That's just very literal. I don't know, tea tree oil would be if there's like an infection sitting on the Mars. Now, why would Mars bring infection? Well, in a petri dish, you can have a bacteria, and when you heat it up, it then all of a sudden grows, right? So Mars actually gives us illness because it creates heat, which is like a petri dish. Iodine, antibiotics, hydrotherapy, which is where you go hot, cold, hot, cold. When kids have fevers, we put them in like a cold towel for 5 minutes, a hot towel for 5 minutes, a cold towel for 5 minutes, and that expels a lot of the heat. Um, Creams, I suppose, exercise and sports of all kinds. That's a big one. Sports are the big Mars remedy, and then balancing adrenals, I guess, through diet and exercise. Why did I say I guess I'm not a big fan of balancing Mars because I'm like purging Mars is probably better than trying to balance it. Like you can take a bunch of Venusian herbs, but you still are pent up, kind of thing.
Quite interesting on the topic of inflammation. And I was trying to remember the transats I was having at the time a couple of the years ago, but I got shingles. And in my mind, I just thought that's something that people get when they're a lot older. But then the people were telling me, well, stress can cause shingles even at a young age. But I had this rash that began in my back, and then it went all across my spine, and then all this red rash around my sides as well. So I'll have to look back at the astrology, but in terms of inflammation, it's quite interesting tying this into Mars as well.
That's exactly that was a Mars transit. I mean, I would bet money on it because and Mars in Aries has the potential to get that hot, right? Rashes are classically Mars, like it's red coming out of the system. It's heat release out of the system. And medical astrologers is like, we just don't necessarily label things, like we don't call it shingles. We're like, we have a different way of diagnosis. We're like, oh, a Mars return with the moon hitting it also. Like that's how we diagnose. But we don't care if it's called shingles or some other weird word. We just, yeah, heat release is a big one like that. So now emotional remedies for Mars. This helps people, just get it out. Sports, obviously, working out, weightlifting. Now tattooing, like I noticed you have a lot of tattoos. And really martial people generally have a lot of tattoos. Acupuncturists know that this is a huge bloodletting, essentially. So it's people who are heavily martial don't mind getting tattooed. Like they're brave enough and also full of blood enough where they're just like, yeah, whatever, I could lose some blood. Like they're just not as afraid. I don't know. Do you mind getting tattooed, or what's your?
In a weird way, I really enjoy it. I enjoy the sensation, well, depending where it is as well, but I enjoy the process, sensation, and yeah, maybe I'm weird, but I think there's a few people out there as well who enjoy getting tattooed.
Yeah. Well, and we would actually say that that's not actually weird. You know what? When we're back to cutters, like cutting is
Mm.
basically like getting tattooed without leaving a picture. It's like, oh, these kids are basically like early tattoo enthusiasts. Like, and so, I bring this up, you're supposed to, as a teacher, be like really G-rated and all this stuff. And it's like astrology is adult school, honestly. It's like we're learning to live and be our warrior selves. I mean, you're a warrior spirit and you're going to be, um, full of tattoos. That's part of the indication of that spirit. And so yeah, there's this guy Schlack, he's this wrestler and he's super martial, and he just like bloodlets himself all the time. He like hits his head and stuff, and there's like people are like, it's how does he do that? And I'm like, oh, full of blood, extra blood, doesn't need it. Like he wants to pop out of his body. It probably feels great for him, kind of thing. So other things are piercing. But then on the more G-rated side, or clean side, house projects. Oh, I have sadomasochism in here. But airing one's grievances, just even like venting, is very martial. Being feisty, roughhousing for kids, skateboarding, mountain biking, yelling, wrestling, pushing through problems, contending, headbanging. Like headbanging is very musical. Mars. Now, adventures and shenanigans are a good one. Like just like being kind of rowdy, text fighting, board games, taking off a layer of clothing. Okay, this one is just like if you're too warm, don't like this drives me nuts actually when I watch moms like put like 50 layers of clothing on their baby. And I'm like, oh my God, that baby in a Mars transit is just like, get it off of me. Like, it's like you definitely don't want to overheat, So um, so if you look at some of these pictures, the head banging on the top left, yeah, the piercings, definitely happen on Mars transits. People get really brave under Mars, and so that's one of the fun things about it. And then we see the tattoos on there. Okay. All right, now Saturn's a good juxtaposition because it feels so different. Saturn vibrations are tightening, constricting, dense, heavy, cold, pressurizing, stressful, structuring, focused, solidifying, limiting. So under Saturn we feel like this, like which is very different than Mars. In fact, the ancient flavor given to Saturn was astringent, which is like when you eat something and you pucker like this, like so. It's like that feeling of being like puckered up, kind of thing. So I have this guy in the bottom left with a clamp on his head. Have you ever had a project that's hanging over your head and you just feel that pressure? Like that's Saturn energy. It's like I gotta get this thing done or whatever. Now why do we have Saturn? We need to fill the limits of incarnation. We need to survive within institutions. Like if you have to fill out paperwork, you got to survive in an institution. You got to, or as a teacher, you got to build your PowerPoint or what you have to survive within the institution. And so, we're supposed to evolve and improve with Saturn, right? Look, this is where we become better. Create boundaries. This is a big one. So Saturn, one of the hard things about it is it cuts things off from us, like people and experiences, and it's because we have too much of that pressure with that thing. Um, Internal feelings of separation from others. Okay, so this, people are always like kind of resenting that feeling of Saturn where you're in a room and you feel alone. You're full surrounded by people, but you feel alone. Well, we would say that Saturn creates that on purpose to keep us improving, excelling, alive, and also able to take care of ourselves. Like kids differentiate a lot under Saturn. Like at 14, the kids have their Saturn opposition and they start to kind of go their own way and feel separate from their parents. And there's actually studies on this that around 14, the parent's voice becomes really irritating to the child, or like that they become bored with their parent actually. And so it's we would say that they're actually going inward to grow and take care of themselves, and that would be what Saturn is about. So stress, things like that. Any comments on Saturn?
There's a great point about Saturn oppositions. Obviously, all of the attention goes towards the Saturn return, which is obviously very important in your late 20s. My Saturn is my outer set malefic. It's the one I have the most issues with. So it was like a slap around the head. And it was a restructuring, as you mentioned before, restructuring that sense of discipline and order. And if you're not going down, in quotes, the right path, Saturn's going to come around and say, right, things need to change, as you mentioned. But we've also got the first Saturn squares, we've got the second waxing Saturn squares, the waning, and so for people to pay attention to all of those transiting manifestations, not just focusing on the Saturn returns in the late 20s and around 60 years old.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, yeah. And the reason I brought up the Saturn opposition is because your kid's 11, right? Like, so in 3 years, you'll be going through that. And so what are the problems of this energy? If you see the guy on the top left, he's just hanging his head, like just depression, um, blockages, problems with authority figures, feeling stifled. A lot of times when we're under Saturn pressure and a boss says anything to us, we're like, oh my God, but it's really that we're sensitive to critique. It's, not even the boss, it's us being sensitive. Feeling labeled or being told who you are, unable to express oneself. Like, when people are in Saturn energy, like they don't feel like it's like their chakras actually stop spinning. Like I remember doing all these pendulum studies in my 20s, and I remember measuring somebody's heart chakra, and then when they had Saturn go over the moon, I measured their heart chakra again, and it was like tiny. And so I always think of like the chakra kind of closing, and so we feel kind of separate energetically. We're not really spinning energy as much. And so like creatives have a real hard time under Saturn because they can't express. But if we look at why that is, it's like they're supposed to concretize maybe what they already visioned. Like I had a vision, now it's time to will make this little sculpture or whatever. You're not supposed to be out expressing, being too cold. Like when people are very Saturnian, like if you had a Saturn moon conjunction in a relationship, they might be cold or emotionally unavailable a lot of the time. And this is hard on people. Experiencing chronic or pain, like you were saying, wherever we have Saturn in our spine, we often see chronic physical pain, and there are remedies for that, don't worry. But necrosis of tissue, that's where the blood flow can get cut off, and the fascia around our Saturn is just really tight, and so that can happen. Feeling critical of one's work, feeling sorry for oneself, adhering to the rules out of fear, quitting tests that are difficult, complaining, blaming, taking medication for depression. I don't think it's necessarily a problem to do that, but I'm just saying, being depressed to the point where you need a med might be a Saturn thing, or shaming ourselves and others. When people feel ashamed, they kind of go inward. It's like anything that kind of makes you go inward. Whereas if we juxtapose it against the Mars energy, see how different they feel. Have you felt this before?
Oh, certainly with Saturn. And I think it comes back to your point before. I don't know about your experience, but I find those people born with, say, as you mentioned before, a moon Saturn conjunction or a moon Saturn square or sun involved. I think because those people already understand that energy when the transits around, I don't find it's as hardcore for them as opposed to the people who don't have those issues natally when those harsh transits come around. It's almost more difficult for the ones who don't understand the energy. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but that's kind of been my experience so far.
Interesting. Like that's a really good point. Like if someone had a Pisces moon and Saturn went over it for a year, they'd be like, why am I so cold and have all these boundaries? Whereas if somebody had a moon Saturn conjunction in Capricorn, they'd be like a great principal of a school with tons of boundaries, and they're really used to it. I agree with you. That's a really good point. Okay. So some physical remedies for Saturn. Now deep massage. So if we had some chronic pain, dental work, that would be if, because sometimes people associate Saturn with the teeth or bones. Chiropractic care. If we have chronic, people always want their chronic physical thing to be fixed in one chiropractic session. But what astrologers know is it's kind of rooted in the fascia and it will come back on transit cyclically. So constant chiropractic work or cyclical chiropractic work can help. Going to an orthopedist, drinking teas with high levels of calcium and magnesium. That's if maybe you had a debilitated Saturn. I was just actually reading the Encyclopedia of Medical Astrology for bone health, and you saying weak Saturns make bone issues, so maybe drinking these like mineral teas. Pressing on the body, squeezing those pressurized areas, structural care. Sometimes people will have a break in a bone at a Saturn point because it's where the body's most stiff, and so it gets brittle there. Seeing an expert specialist, physical therapy and water. Okay, warming methods such as moxibustion. So if we look at the top left picture, that's moxibustion. That's now Saturn's cold and it takes away heat, whereas Mars brings heat. Can you imagine putting moxibustion on your Mars placement? Like, oh my god, that'd be horrible. Like have a fever and then someone does moxibustion on you. No, but if you had your Saturn spot, which is really cold, then we might heat that up. But a heating pad would be similar to, moxibustion. If you see the woman on the middle left doing yoga, constantly stretching your body can combat those kind of stiffening aspects of Saturn. And yeah, chiropractic massage. Okay. Now, honestly, physical remedies, I, this is one where it's like I really like to take each case and really look at where the Saturn is in the body and because it's like you actually need focused care usually. Like let's say someone had a Mars Saturn conjunction in Taurus and they would get chronic trapped inflammation like in these two vertebrae. It's just where Taurus lives is right here. So we would want that chiropractic care or that deep tissue massage to be right here. Like I don't want you guys to think that this is general. Like if you have a Saturn problem, you should just get a general massage. Well, we actually hone in medically. And I do readings, like I'm not a doctor, but I do read the chart for specifics, but we get very specific with remedy. It's not just general. Any comments on this slide?
Wondering about your personal life. What remedies have worked for you personally, whether it's been Saturn or Mars involved? What's been your experience?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I had chronic asthma. I have Mars in Cancer and Saturn in Leo, and Saturn in Leo traps the lower lobe of the lung actually. And I, for years, I just couldn't get rid of this lower lobe asthma, and the Mars in Cancer brings inflammation around the lobe of the lung. So I finally had Rolfing. I had structural and reconstruction of that lower lobe of the lung, and I haven't had asthma ever since. I basically had somebody release my Saturn. She's an astrokinesiologist. Her name's Casey Cardoso. I work with her all the time. But yeah, she could see my Saturn line, and we just went right on those vertebrae and those dermatomes, what they're called, and released that. With my Mars in Cancer, I get a lot of inflammation in the front shoulder, and I'm a sign language interpreter, so my arm will get really inflamed, and so I cup it. I do a lot of heat pulling out of heat from the front of the shoulder. That's physical stuff, but
Oh, wow. I just find it curious that you enjoy these malefic topics and you've both undignified both the Saturn and the Mars as well. I think that's curious.
that's true. That's true. I have sad malefics, which I'll take them, man. I'll take them.
So you're like, I'm going to talk about them. Wonderful. I'll say to everybody as well as watching, I'd love to hear your stories. So your Mars and Saturn issues, let us know in the comments below. I'd just be interested to hear everybody else as well.
I think the reason I brought these topics to the table is because for the students, it's for them. These are the things that people struggle with the most. Jupiter problems. Yes, sometimes we get issues there, but people often lament Mars and Saturn. Emotional remedies for Saturn. Now, these are more along my style. Working, time alone to continue working. A lot of times we're just expected to just hang out and just be constantly social. And it's like, people call it depression when you're under Saturn, but we would actually say it's the soul going inward to work on manifesting something. So, practicing, if you had Saturn going over your Venus, like practicing the piano for a year, like maybe you don't feel like going out and playing a show, but you do feel like getting better, things like that. discipline, scheduling things. Scheduling things is a huge one. So let's say somebody has Saturn going over the moon and they feel cut off from other people. Well, schedule time with people. And that's one of the biggest, because when you're cut off chakrically, you might not just be flowing with people naturally. So if you schedule it, it happens. That is the flow, I guess, would be to schedule. Self-imposed rules, boundaries, silence, like a Saturn Mercury conjunction. These people are so quiet, actually. And so just letting them be silent could be, a remedy. Distance, contrived separation, creating circumstances that incite longing. Now, this would be like if you have a partner and you feel cut off from them on Saturn, well, maybe sleep in your own room for a few months or something, not with the intent of splitting up, but with the intent of providing longing, like I long for you kind of thing, as opposed to like I feel distant from you. It's like you contrive distance, things like that. Persistent effort, being squeezed or held tight is a great one emotionally under Saturn, to have someone just like squeeze it out of you. Clearing clutter, building structure. We don't have to go through all of them, but I think you get the idea that, see how these are very different than Mars remedies. Like when you see those two together. So if you see this woman on the middle right, she's going off alone to the beach to think. And I think that would be a very Saturn, a beautiful use of Saturn. And then the schedule on the bottom, seeing how rigid that schedule is, it's on a piece of graph paper. That's very Saturn, right? Is like schedule it all. And then
My key word out of these sentences is silence. So when I'm feeling low, I just need, like the lady at the beach, I need to be alone. I don't need anyone comforting me or calling me, because some people enjoy having conversations to feel better. I'm like, just leave me alone for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, and I'll like you said, make a structure, make a new schedule, but I like being alone in those cases. How about you? How do you like to do that?
Yeah, I do a lot of scheduling and like I have Saturn going over my Pisces moon. I have Pisces moon at 14. And when that transit was coming, it's going through my 10th house, I definitely didn't allow any depression to set in. I said, I am going to schedule myself for public appearances for one straight year because it's in the 10th house, right? So I just I just went to basically like for example, going on Facebook, I just litigiously did it daily, basically. So I do a lot of structure. I don't like Saturn to manifest through depression because I'm kind of a heavy hitter. So it's like I don't like to be stopped, basically. Yeah, I'm more of a scheduler. All right. And yeah, I think that was our kind of glimpse into what the class remediation will be like. We'll be dealing with all the planets, aspects, all the things that go into remediation for any chart. You'll be at the end of that class be able to handle one case at a time, essentially. So all ideas were taken from this textbook, and you can get it one or two ways. You can go on Amazon and actually just purchase the book, or you can get a PDF copy from me by emailing me. And the reason I have a PDF copy is when it's on your computer, you can actually refer to it with clients. I do that all the time. If they're in a Mars transit, I go to the Mars chapter and we just look at it. It's kind of useful.
Fantastic. And for everybody watching, I'll leave those links both in the description and comment boxes, and also links to the class, which is coming up in January. You can find out more information there.
I so appreciate you having me on, Callum.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And like I said, I'm just going to quickly show my chart just to show some of the manifestations of issues with the malefics. Okay, so this is my chart. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm now going through, excuse me, my second waxing Saturn square. And this started off around June of this year. So I thought before it happened, I was like, I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what's going to manifest. So natally, just taking a look at my natal Saturn, is my outer sect malefic. Now, I find with people, whichever outer set malefic you have is usually the most troublesome, at least in my experience. As you can see, I have a night chart with the sun below the horizon. So Saturn is my outer set malefic. Now, accidentally, it's in the cadent house, not particularly strong. Yes, it does have some dignity by trisplicity, but it really is my troublesome planet. And, it's moving towards that Uranus as well, which I think is a factor. Now, if I compare this with my natal Mars, as I mentioned before, my Mars is domicile, it's in its own terms, it's direct, it's in an angular house, it's insect. So I usually don't have many issues in Mars. It's usually my friend, but as Andrea says before, it can still cause issues. Okay, so what was happening this year? So I wondered what would come around. So around this time, I think it was literally 2 days after the first touch of the Saturn square natal Saturn. And this was more of a manifestation of things happening at home. So Saturn also rules my fourth and fifth house in a whole sign chart. Saturn ruling my fourth house. Now, what's the thing that happened? My fridge broke down. So I thought, absolutely brilliant. This is this is going to be a good start. So number one, my fridge broke down. 3 or 4 days later, the oven broke. And then I think a week or two after that, the toaster broke. So it was literally Saturn square, ruling the fourth house, things breaking down. So that's how it's manifested me for this year. So if we take this chart forward, because Saturn has obviously been going retrograde and back and forth. So if we take it up to, let's see, let's go to November around this time. So just last week, Saturn is vibrating because it's gone from its retrograde and stationed direct. Now, usually you'll find with any planet that's stationing, either to go retrograde or direct, usually has extra energy. Stationed to go direct last week. What happened? I sat down last week, put on the TV, and that broke down as well. So literally things breaking down. I've still got, as we go further on, that last hit of Saturn, which is going to go back and make its last square with the Saturn and then be on its merry way. So this is just an example of things that can go awry, especially with Saturn, things that can break down, especially in the Saturn squares. So, Andrea, would you like to jump in and have any thoughts on this?
Sure, and we would say under a Saturn, you're particularly sensitive to the breaking down of things. But I definitely think, with Saturn, we want to manifest a better life, right? So like we're noticing everywhere that our house is not perfect, and we're like, we gotta make improvements around here. And if we looked at Saturn and Pisces, we'd say this is affecting the vibe. Like I can't have people over with a broken fridge, and I can't, enjoy things with a broken toaster. So I think and then maybe Saturn natally and Sag, it's like you're losing the adventure you're on at home. It's like I can't be watching my TV or whatever. But I do think it definitely is that pressure to manifest a structure that is solid, right? And so like all these breakdowns are really honing in on where's your structure not solid, and can we get better basically. So the new fridge, the new TV, like at the end of the transit, you're going to have a really solid place to live with a solid structure. But yeah, it came with this sensitivity to the crumbling of anything that is going on there. But yeah, and also maybe
Points because I like, oh, sorry to interrupt. I like what you were saying before about the distinction between some things can manifest physically or there can be emotional remedies as well. So obviously how this is seeming to be playing out in my life right now is physical objects in the home breaking down, which can obviously be remedied by bringing new things in. And I love what you're saying about a new structure will come into place and hopefully that will continue. But it's just a great point to say that just because you have these Saturn transits or you're looking at your progressions, solar returns, etc., it can manifest in many, many different ways. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be physical, but not to the body. It could be something that's happening around you or in your life. So there's many different ways that these signatures can manifest in one's life.
absolutely, and I think you were brilliant to bring in the house and the the ruler where it's ruling and everything like that, because we get down to the specifics of what structures are being affected, and where am I limited, and things like that. So it's going to look different in each case.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for a very insightful and a very honest, direct, which I love, presentation about the two malefics. And just to reiterate, everybody watching, I'll leave all the links in the descriptions and comment boxes below. And Andrea, I'd love to have you back on again at some point to talk about something else.
Sure, I'd love to, and I'd love to do a reading group at Kepler if people ever want to do that. So you had mentioned that earlier, and just to plant in the seed for that.
Absolutely, yeah. So Kepler, many of you might not be familiar, but we have a book club, which is, and I'll stick a link to that as well. It's our Facebook book club. I think we've got over 1,000 members now. So each month Misty, our admin, will interview authors, and you have a fantastic book with the astrological remediation. So look out for that in the future, because Andrea could be on there and be doing a Q&A. So everybody watching this can go and find that in the Facebook group, which I'll link below.
All right, and I just want to say I'm so looking forward to working with the students at Kepler. Like, it's a lifelong dream. So,
Absolutely wonderful. Well, we're very, very happy to have you here at Kepler, and thank you so much for joining us today.
all right, thank you.
Cheers. Goodbye, everyone. See you next time.